I think we're going to start to sit back down and have some extremely preliminary concluding thoughts. And I can see there's conversations and little clusters happening all over, and we want to very much expand on that spirit of conversation in these last few minutes that we have together.
Thanks. Okay. All right. So what I thought I'd do is I took a few notes around a few different cluster of categories. I think I have around 7. And I'll try to maybe introduce them really briefly and hope that they might trigger some association or something that has been brewing for you that would provide an opportunity to share. And I'll ask Julian Jeffrey as well. So I already earlier this morning talked about bastard children and wrong forks. But that of course we started with Freed. Sabina brought up Freed right away, and a few others brought up Freed on the blog and throughout. But it was kind of interesting how we actually let go of him a bit. That this conversation wasn't dominated by the particular way that he located theatricality, outside of the palatable. But it continues, I think, throughout, both in Jeffrey talking about film being the bastard child, being associated with mass culture, and then equivocally being incorporated into the museum context. Or even today, just now, Sabina talking about the way that some of these forms have been around but been other in the museum, or the side dish, the parallel event. So that's a theme. Another is obviously the many different forms, the many different types of temporality we're really talking about, which can be, of course, attached to different forms, whether it's the way we count in a dance studio, or the time of photography that Alan so beautifully made sure we knew and brought forward. The way that both Becca and Jens were talking around forms of temporality that are theatrical, not necessarily performance art, not necessarily performative, but making certain kinds of distinctions around that specific form, or even that, as I brought up earlier, the narrative form of the book, the Moby Dick that Jens was bringing up. Obviously film and its many different temporalities in the way that that many of the artists and critics were encouraging us to have multiple ways of understanding even a single form when it comes to video or film, or thinking too about Nora talking about sound and the manipulations around sound, and then that particular way that time both continues and stops when the film continues without sound. Something that I also found like beautifully re-embodied in Okwi when we heard her crying and then watched her continue to cry in silence, which, as I said to Nora, I went immediately to Mother Courage and that silent scream. So different forms of temporality, all the way now, of course, to Chamber Street and all that, that Liz is reminding us and making sure that we know, and we need to work for the next iteration to think more about music and the notion of the score as a fundamental springboard. Language has been a huge thing. What language we use to describe what. The constraints of language, the imprecision of it, and as Jonah really reminded us, the way in which we get into certain types of binary frames, like object versus time, or theater versus visual art, that then also end up obscuring differentiations within categories. So that theater is not theater is not theater. Visual art is not visual art is not visual art. I mean, when he made that point about the proscenium being different from the black box, et cetera. So that hazard of language, but also the possibilities of language, of the way that, say, taking the notion of a score to a new context, an old tradition to a new context, sort of dynamizes a new context, and also sort of gives the concept of the score back to itself differently. Or similarly, when Joe rehears the term choreography through Sabina's use of it. A familiar term, an all too familiar term that he rehears, or Rebecca Schneider using elaborating on the idea of patina or even film, which got a different hearing here once we thought of it as the layer and that coating associated with patina. I talked about a fourth category I'm calling musical chairs, but that particular way in which forms are being moved across different places, the ways that I brought up earlier, people are wondering if the grass will be greener in new contexts in which they're moving, whether the toys that they have there will be better or worse. But also not only how that affects different art forms and practices, but also divisions within institutions, within academic departments. We talked about the renaming of varieties of departments from video art to social practice, new genres, which hasn't been renamed but maybe should, or what is art history, what is theater and performance and dance, and what is film and media, we can say right there. And similarly, also, obviously, the musical chairs within, it seems, institutions, whether they be museums or other types of art organizations, where who is photography and what is media, who is education, who is painting, all are also, we have these chairs being moved and sliced. And along with that, a certain amount of anxiety about what does it mean that you've been placed in a new chair. What does it mean that you get the Whitney Prize and find that you're scared or that you're sick with fear? Or Alan, I think, was so generous to note that particular anxiety that you might be replaced. Not only that you're moving to a new place, but that someone else is taking one's place. Audience, different ways of thinking about, obviously, the audience member as an integrated part of the work, but also that even the language we might use to talk about that figure changes if we think of an audience member as a beholder or a viewer or a gazer or a participant or a reader, or with Judy's, or as a wrong-footed perceiver of perception whose whole nervous system is involved. Those are different ways of thinking about what it is to encounter. And then a term that's a line of thought that's terribly important to me is around support systems. I tend to think both aesthetically and socially about support systems and how they become integrated, whether we're thinking about profit, nonprofit, state-based systems, informal or self-organized art organizations. I think about Darcy's, but also the support systems that end up being, say, inside of the work, whether they end up being like Ferran inside of the work, where he as a certain artist support system becomes inside the work, and even their competition comes inside, or thinking about the final picture, Darcy's staff and colleagues, you have that sort of sense of that team of people that reminds you of the relationality of the support system that keeps this art going, but that is also challenged along the way. And then more and more, some of these places where the support system becomes an infrastructure that is interior to the work, not outside of the work or external to it, whether in artist-run gallery spaces that are also art projects or artworks, as we heard with Daniel, or Jonah's discussion about theatrical infrastructure, but also his notion that the visual artist contribution to his collaborations are also support systems. That was a way of phrasing that he used. Or even I was talking to Judy about the notion that man walking down a building is a duet with the person holding the pulley. So that notion that it's interior to the work I found quite striking. Another thought I have to just reiterate, and I think it came up right from the beginning with Sabina's talk and all the way through, the notion that a certain kind of time-based practice, a turn to events, et cetera, is on the one hand understood to be a radical move away from object-based process, object making, and at the same time fully consonant with this much larger change, which we can talk in a very easy, perhaps too easy way, as a Fordist to post-Fordist turn, But that particular way that I know it is very fast and loose that some have of saying we once made objects in the industrial mode, now we are turning to a service economy that is whose virtuosic labor makes immaterial products, something that Sabina brought up here at the end, and so that the creation of experience, the creation of the event, is consonant with this, the creation of hospitality, the creation of a service economy and the maintenance of a service economy that is very much how capital runs, how things are motored right now. So that that pressure that so many of the curators voiced of thinking of performances and time-based works of various sorts not only as this sort of radical break, but is fully consonant with the creation of the inclusive museum, the blockbuster exhibit, and the pressure for a certain kind of spectacle. And the last thing I would say, I have it as schools and PST. But the particular way that this keeps coming up about the function of schools in California on the West Coast, as experimental laboratories and support systems for really vital work. And I think that that is something that became so very clear in so much of what came out in of Pacific Standard Times and the whole coordination, and certainly is very much on view in Connie Llewellyn's exhibit as well. And so I think also together about what those of us who are on the West Coast and beyond, how we think about the educational environment as that kind of laboratory and how we might make a sort of a new round together. So those are some points of contact. Anyone want to?
That was so comprehensive. I don't know. I just want to add one word that that may or may not be pertinent at all, but the idea of the curator as custodian. And I was thinking about Steve's side, talking about scooping the dead goldfish out of the mountain pike thing, and all the different roles that we've heard about, that the maintenance that actually has to happen to keep works and performances and time-based events going. Yeah. But I also think, correct me if I'm wrong, dance people, that custodian is the term that people use if you're the person who knows the dance. Is that right? Isn't that you're a custodian?
Sometimes.
Sometimes.
Do people use it? You're the.
I've heard that. Yours, yes. Somebody is nodding. Yeah, that you're the custodian. So in a way that you you can learn that you're a transmitter, that you can learn an action in your body and hold it in your muscles, and thus
the ballet mistress.
Right. So the custodian is an act of caretaking that happens in your muscle memory also, and so there's this way that word nicely connects in some ways. The kind of the rote acts of cleaning up and the labor that goes into that, but also how we need to keep that, restaging or reenacting or reliving these histories sometimes happens in this extremely bodily way.
Yeah, thank you.
One thing I wanted to bring up, which I feel in some ways wasn't addressed particularly directly, and here we are sitting in at UC Berkeley, a public institution that's quickly being privatized, and the relationship between the kinds of discussions that we're having, particularly with the centrality of the museum and other kinds of private cultural institutions, is are we thinking enough about what public art policy is in this country, and what our role is in raising those questions? I mean, I've been around long enough. I came up in the publicly funded alternative spaces, and there were discussions all the time by curators and arts administrators and artists about money, about economics, about how things were being funded, about sustainability, which as that world sort of has receded, seems to be spoken about in political terms less and less, and the move toward the museums, and it's extraordinary to see curators working so hard to adapt the museum to the changing needs of artists, but at the same time, are we losing a kind of multiplicity of venues and experiences and relations to the community as we centralize, our culture within these private institutions and singular institutions.
Or nonprofits, but are funded by private philanthropy, right?
Right.
Okay. Other thoughts, questions, elaborations, disagreements? Yes, Jens. Please, come on down. In fact, I'd love it if a lot of people were a lot closer.
Yeah. Okay. I think one of the things that I thought was really interesting when we were talking about the sort of way of how musicians try to reposition themselves within the sort of cultural landscape. And we often came back, and maybe this was also me in particular, talking about the Tino Sehgal exhibition and the Marina Abramovic exhibition, and the sort of like ways in which performance art in those type of contexts often is sort of like degraded to really be what Sabine was talking as sort of like the sideshow or the side dish. And I kind of felt like maybe there could have been a little bit more conversation around that, because this is sort of like where I feel a really sort of problematic situation begins to occur, where like a gap opens up between a sort of more serious examination of a practice, the way we've done it here over the last 3 days, and the use of performance to create, and I think I mentioned that in my talk, sort of, create celebrity or spectacle. I'm thinking about projects at the Guggenheim that Francesco Vizzoli did there with Performer, where they had Natalie Portman and Tilda Swinton and all these type of people on stage reading, and it becomes a sort of like almost sort of Hollywood event, and it's completely and utterly disconnected to what I'm interested in, and I think what you guys are talking about as well. So ultimately it sort of like becomes this thing where there's not this one art world anymore, but there's sort of like 10 different ones, and they're sort of like becoming increasingly disconnected. I'm not even sure if I'm in your world and you're in mine, or or Desiree is in ours, or and so on and so forth.
Can we take that up for a bit? Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to talk about that, because I often thought that dance and performing arts in museums was like the accessory or accessorizing. It was there to dress up the important exhibit, and I think that's shifting. But one thing I noticed that hasn't shifted so far in the dance presentations that I've witnessed and experienced is there are very little contextualizing materials. There are very little talks around what's being presented. There are no publications. The curators are, I think still tentative and nervous and want to know, but perhaps could reach out more to scholars within dance or other curators, and I think that's shifting. I'm seeing that happening. But I agree, why? So you see the beautiful work in the beautiful space, and then you walk away and you really don't have any information about the choreographer or the dancer or the context or the history or even in creative ways, Jens, which you're doing in your work, how to handle that, I think is the next step that I see. I also just want to say one burning thing while I have the microphone, which has been on my mind about Civil War reenactments and reperforming and all of that. And it's been on I was sort of churning away and thinking about what is different. And I showed Man walking down the side of a building, and I know it was not the same, and it was glamorous, and there were all these issues in New York. But what was different than a reenactment, you don't have ammunition in the gun. When you're watching someone walk down that building, it's precarious. And I think that in this sense of reperforming, even Marina's reperformers, I knew many of them, it's as if they're fake, but they're actually in real time. And I feel like we should look at this from the perspective of the actual performer and dancer, rather than just as object, as, there's a little bit too much rush to judgment around that, I want to say.
Thank you.
It was precarious but properly insured.
Right. Here, Nora and Simon, too.
I just wanted to pick up again on this sort of idea of dance and performance within museum spaces. And going back to what Rebecca mentioned, I think on the first day, where she talked about the commodity of the live. And this sort of also connects to Mark's comments about the museum as basically having dead objects, static objects. And so that when you're introducing the live into this space, and I thought also of Godard's Bande à part, where they go running through the museum, through the Louvre, and you've got all that life and energy going through at a sort of breakneck pace. And it made me, though, think about what came up, I think it was also on the first day, about zombies and the sort of the trope of the zombie connected to labor. And then I was thinking, well, maybe it's not really a zombie. And this kind of connects to what Andrew was mentioning, that what hasn't really been discussed here is new media or media, and the internet and the digital. And I was thinking of maybe instead of a zombie, we should be talking about avatars. And that with the access of, sort of the internet, I mean, we can show examples on YouTube, as was done several times. We can access images from museums all through the internet. But what you can't access then becomes the live performance. And if this isn't a way...
That's what retroactively gets called.
Moment, exactly. And so if this shift isn't also part of maybe an anxiety of still legitimating an existence of the physical materiality of the museum or the institution.
I think maybe we'll just accumulate some questions since we're at the time we have to end. So let's accumulate thoughts. And, yeah, go ahead, Simon.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just have a very short comment about de-skilling and its relationship to what you were talking about, the changing status of museum. And that is that, in Buchloh, de-skilling is tied also to an aesthetic. But in the sense that we are thinking about de-skilling, I think one of the things that we also need to mention is that de-skilling is in some ways directly tied to the wild speculation of art. In the sense that a Damien Hirst is worth more than a Rembrandt today. So to follow up on, I just want to say something from an artist's perspective, okay? In terms of, I'm very happy that Julia brought up curating and how in some ways the curator is a person who holds the dance in some ways, since Julia and I both took a dance class together. and I want to actually put some pressure on the notion of curating in relationship to care. And that comes from, it's basically Duchamp, right? So in some ways, one can say that just like the holy water that is water and is transformed through this particular blessing or whatever, the Duchampian, one thing that I always want to impress upon, students is the relationship between care and the ready-made, in that it is a type of selection that is done with great care, and he had very, very few, he chose very, very few objects, less than 20, during a 60-year period when he could have made many ready-mades. And this idea of curating, this idea of care, I think it's not really just tied to the curator, since we learned it from Duchamp. But what Duchamp does is to think of a relationship of care in relationship to an institution that we can maybe refocus a la something like a Foucauldian model of the care of the self. So in some ways, I think, the anxiety of an artist listening to, museum people and institutional, spokespeople talking about art is that, I'm very, very sympathetic to what Liz was bringing up, which is, we oftentimes make things for each other. We oftentimes make things not for institutions. We oftentimes do it for each other as a form of rehearsal. We oftentimes focus on the rehearsal rather than the product. And artists, I as one, we often look for venues that are actually smaller and less, I guess less spectacular in some ways, because it's what the work needs, and it's basically the care of ourselves, that for which we are making this work.
Thank you. Beautiful. If you need
I have to do my own musical chairs thing here and leave because I'm out of time. So thank you all so much.
Can we pass it to Daniel? Ash, can we pass it to Daniel? Actually, he had his hand up before.
I guess I wanted to, again, maybe I'm going to echo a little something, Simon, talking from an artist's point of view, but I'm going to throw up one red flag that I hear, which is, and I heard it a lot right now, is a lot of tribalism, a lot of people moving back into essentialized positions, protecting very specific territory specifically about dance or about particular time-based this or a particular, and it worries me because that wasn't what our conversation was, nor what I heard you speak about the intention of a cross-disciplinary methodology or means by which to start to look at time-based, the idea of time-based processes across both that which moves when we see it move and that which, I mean, there are not dead objects. I'm sorry. They're not dead in the museum. They don't, just because they're not moving in front of your eyes doesn't mean they're not, I mean, I guess I just heard like 50 red flags right now. It seemed the opposite of what the intention was to bring a cross-representation of ideas together. And I also worry about the idea that there is a answer.
Right.
And I also worry, or a solution to a multiplicity of types of issues of sustainability, of funding, of venue, of theoretical directions, of methodologies for analysis, rigorous critical environments and examinations of these things. And so the end bothers me, actually, here, right now, because instead of us opening to a door that would allow for a real cross-pollination intellectually and physically, I heard the opposite of that.
Okay.
And so,
Thank you. Okay. Okay. We'll fight against that, and if to the extent I contributed to it, my apologies. I don't think there are any silver bullets. No silver bullets on any of the. So a last thought. If we can get a mic up to Jonah. Thank you, Jonah.
By no means a last word, but a last thought.
Yeah.
I could harmonize with a lot of what's been said, but also looking forward, I'm so sorry that we didn't have a larger chance to tackle architecture. That we referred to certain iconic spaces in museums without naming the architects of those spaces.
Yeah, that's right.
So even I myself could have been more specific in saying, rather than saying, or rather than any of us saying MoMA, it's an atrium designed by Taniguchi, and it's very specific. It's very different from Breuer, and so we made wonderful and specific time, but maybe articulating space would be another.
And the time-based work in architecture is such a huge conversation. So thank you. All right. I encourage all of you to also go to the blog or send more blog posts to us via Sarah Gibbons if you'd like to say more. Comment on other people's thoughts if you have more reflection as one way to keep going. But please stay in touch. We do hope to have more iterations of versions of like this, and we have pilot upon pilot and try to keep improving and expanding. So thank you so much, diehards, for sticking with us, and we'll see you next time.